She believed she had found stability beside an admired man, living in a luxurious penthouse that promised safety. But behind the shine and silence hid a prison built of psychological control, manipulation, and betrayal. Upon discovering a cruel plan to erase her from her own life, she used the same surveillance tools to rewrite her destiny. What was once a cage became evidence, and her voice, once silenced, rose as the force that changed everything. She believed she had found stability beside an admired man, living in a luxurious penthouse that promised safety. But behind the shine and silence hid a prison built of psychological control, manipulation, and betrayal. Upon discovering a cruel plan to erase her from her own life, she used the same surveillance tools to rewrite her destiny. What was once a cage became evidence, and her voice, once silenced, rose as the force that changed everything. Marianne held the teacup between her hands as she watched the city of London stretch out infinitely beyond the attic window. The view was breathtaking, sharp skyscrapers cutting through the grey afternoon sky, traffic swarming below like a living, pulsating organism. She never imagined she would live in a place like this, so high, so luxurious, so far from the modest flat in Notting Hill where she had grown up sketching clothes in old notebooks. Her pregnancy was already in its 5th month, and her rounded belly was beginning to shift her center of balance. She felt heavy, but also complete in a way she had never experienced before. Raphael had insisted she move into the attic as soon as they found out about the baby. He was like that, decisive, protective, always with a ready solution for everything. A successful entrepreneur in corporate technology, Raphael Miller commanded one of the country's most promising startups, specializing in digital security systems. Everyone admired him. Marianne admired him too, or at least she thought she did. In the beginning, everything seemed like a modern fairy tale. Raphael had met her at an independent fashion exhibition at the Scarlet Gallery, where Marianne was showcasing her first collection. She still remembered his gaze across the room, determined, interested. They talked for hours about art, about creating things from nothing, about the courage needed to build something of one's own. He seemed genuinely fascinated by her work, by the way she transformed fabrics into visual narratives. 2 weeks later, they were dining at sophisticated restaurants. A month later, he was introducing her as his partner at corporate events. 3 months later, she was pregnant. The move to the attic was presented as a gesture of love. Raphael explained that he needed to ensure she and the baby had the best, that her flat in Notting Hill was charming but didn't offer the necessary security. The attic had a state-of-the-art surveillance system, a reinforced concierge desk, a private elevator. It was the perfect place for a future mother, he said. Marianne agreed, because it seemed to make sense, because she wanted to believe she was building a family, because Raphael spoke with such certainty that questioning him felt like ingratitude. But now, 3 months after the move, something had changed. Or perhaps it had always been this way, and she simply hadn't noticed. The attic was beautiful, no doubt. Italian marble floors, glass walls, Scandinavian design furniture, carefully selected artworks. Everything was clean, minimalist, impeccable, but it was also too quiet, too controlled. Marianne began to notice that Raphael had an opinion about everything, about the clothes she wore, always suggesting something more discreet, more suitable for a future mother. About the friends she saw, questioning why she still kept in touch with people from her university days, people who didn't understand her new level of life. About her schedule, always wanting to know where she was, with whom, for how long. Initially, Marianne interpreted this as care. Raphael was worried it was natural, but gradually the care began to feel like something else. He always knew when she went out, even if she didn't tell him. He always commented on places she had visited, people she had talked to. Once he casually mentioned that she seemed to have enjoyed lunch at the Japanese restaurant on Oxford Street. Marianne froze. She hadn't mentioned that lunch. When she asked how he knew, Raphael laughed and said he had seen her location on her phone, that they shared location for mutual security. Marianne didn't remember activating that, but she wasn't sure either. Pregnancy sometimes made her memory hazy, Felicity, her best friend since design school, started to visit more frequently. Marianne was happy with the visits. She felt Felicity was one of the few threads that still connected her to her old life. They had been inseparable for years, sharing a tiny studio, dreaming together of the day their brands would be in the windows of Bond Street. Felicity also worked in fashion, but had taken a different path, specializing in image consulting for executives. It was through her that Marianne had gotten some of her first important clients. But lately, something seemed different about Felicity's visits. She spent too much time talking to Raphael. She laughed at his jokes. She stayed, late discussing business, as Raphael was expanding the company and needed someone to handle corporate image. Felicity was perfect for that, he said. Marianne tried not to be bothered. They were friends, just friends. Raphael was helping Felicity professionally, just as he had helped Marianne in the past. It was generosity, not a reason for suspicion. One afternoon, Marianne was in the bedroom when she heard their voices in the living room. They weren't shouting, but there was an intimacy in the tone that made her stop. She approached the door silently, her heart racing for no apparent reason. Raphael was talking about a new project, something about company restructuring. Felicity responded with excitement, using that professional yet warm tone she reserved for special clients. Then Raphael said something about Marianne, about how fragile she was now, how she needed protection, how important it was that everything be prepared for when the baby was born. Felicity agreed, saying Marianne had always been sensitive, too creative for practical matters. Raphael chuckled softly, a laugh Marianne didn't recognize, and said that was exactly why he was taking care of everything. Marianne felt a chill down her spine, but couldn't explain exactly why. She went back to the bedroom and lay on the immense bed, staring at the white ceiling. The baby moved inside her, a gentle flutter that always calmed her. She placed her hand on her belly and took a deep breath. She was overreacting, for sure. Pregnancy made everything more intense, emotions amplified. Raphael loved her. Felicity was her friend. Everything was fine. But that night, when Raphael came home from work, he brought a pile of documents. He explained they were company papers, some contracts that needed to be updated. He asked her to sign where he had marked, with yellow post-its. Marianne took the papers, tried to read them, but the legal jargon was confusing and her eyes were tired. Raphael said she didn't need to worry, that they were just formalities, that he had already reviewed everything with the lawyers. She trusted him, so she signed. She signed without reading completely. She signed because she was tired, because she wanted to believe he would take care of everything. That night, lying beside Raphael, who slept deeply, Marianne stayed awake for hours. She looked at the glass walls reflecting the illuminated city outside and felt she was inside. A beautiful, transparent dome. Everything was visible from the inside out, but also from the outside in. She was exposed, observed, contained. The word that came to her mind was strange, but insistent. Cage. A beautiful cage, but a cage nonetheless. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. It was paranoia. It had to be paranoia. She was building a family. She was about to be a mother. She was safe. But why then did she feel this tightness in her chest, this feeling that the luxurious attic was getting smaller every day, as if the glass walls were slowly closing in, without anyone else noticing but her? The following days brought a routine Marianne didn't remember choosing, but which had somehow settled in as if it had always existed. Every morning Raphael prepared breakfast. It was a kind gesture. She tried to think of it that way. He arranged the table with geometrically cut fruits, green juice, wholemeal toast. But when Marianne asked for a croissant or a piece of cake, he frowned and explained that pregnant women needed to maintain a balanced diet, that too much sugar was bad for the baby, that she needed to trust his knowledge. After all, he had hired a specialized nutritionist. Marianne ate the fruits and felt that each bite was a small surrender. Her clothes had also changed. The wardrobe she had brought from Notting Hill, full of colorful dresses, oversized blouses, wide-leg trousers she had customized herself, was gradually replaced. Raphael came home with bags from expensive stores, black or gray dresses, neutral colors, straight cuts. He said she needed appropriate clothes for her new phase, that the fabrics were better for sensitive pregnancy skin, that those vibrant colors attracted unnecessary attention. Marianne accepted, because it was easier than arguing, because he always seemed to have a ready argument, because she was starting to doubt her own taste. Felicity kept showing up, now almost daily. She worked in the office Raphael kept within the attic, a glass-walled room overlooking Regent Street. Marianne heard their laughter, the sound of conversations that seemed to flow with natural ease. Sometimes when she entered the room to get water, they both stopped talking abruptly, as if they had been interrupted in something private. Felicity smiled and asked how Marianne was feeling, with that tone of concern that sounded vaguely condescending. Raphael placed a hand on Marianne's shoulder and said she should rest more, that she didn't need to worry about anything, that he and Felicity were taking care of everything. One afternoon, Marianne decided to look through the papers she had signed weeks ago. She was restless with that persistent feeling that she had lost something important, but couldn't identify what. She opened her laptop and tried to access the system of the company she and Raphael had founded together, Cloud Secure. She had a right to, after all, she was a co-founder, even if in recent months she had stepped back. Due to pregnancy, the password didn't work. She tried again, thinking she might have typed it wrong. Nothing. A message appeared on the screen saying her access had been deactivated. Marianne's heart pounded. It was a mistake. It had to be a mistake. When Raphael arrived, she asked about the access. He seemed calm, almost surprised by the question. He explained that they had restructured the security system, that it was standard protocol to deactivate inactive accesses. Marianne wasn't actively working, so it made sense, he said, but she could have access at any time, she just needed to ask. But when she asked, Raphael said he needed to do it personally at the central office, that the protocols were strict, that they would do it next week. Next week came, and he said he was too busy, that they would do it the following week. Marianne realized she was being pushed away from her own creation, but every time she tried to question him, Raphael had a logical, reasonable explanation that made her feel like she was overreacting. It was Julia, her former studio assistant, who planted the first concrete doubt. Julia called one day anxious, saying she needed to talk in person. Marianne suggested she come to the attic, but Julia insisted it be at a cafe far away. Marianne felt a strange chill at the request, but agreed. When she told Raphael she was going out to meet Julia, he asked where, for how long, if she needed him to come along. Marianne said no, it was just a quick coffee between friends. Raphael nodded, but there was something in his gaze that seemed to be calculating, measuring, filing away the information. At the cafe on Carnaby Street, Julia was nervous. She fidgeted with her hands, looked around. She started by saying that maybe she shouldn't be there, that maybe it was better not to say anything, but her conscience wouldn't let her. Then she said she had received a strange offer. A man had called her offering money in exchange for information about Marianne, about the old studio projects, about contacts, about clients. When Julia asked who he was, the man said he worked for Cloud Secure, that it was a routine verification for internal processes. Julia was suspicious and didn't give anything away, but she was disturbed. Why would Marianne's company be investigating its own co-founder? Marianne felt the ground give way. She tried to find a rational explanation, but couldn't. Julia continued, saying there was more. Some people in the fashion industry had commented that Marianne was withdrawing, that she no longer responded to emails, that she seemed to have abandoned her projects. Julia knew it wasn't true. She knew Marianne well enough to know she would never voluntarily abandon her work. But to the market, the narrative was being constructed. Marianne was pregnant, she was dedicating herself to her family, she was withdrawing from the professional world. It was a beautiful story, but it wasn't her story. Marianne returned to the attic with trembling legs. She entered silently and heard voices coming from the office. This time she didn't hesitate. She approached the door, which was ajar, and stood there, invisible, listening. Raphael was talking about deadlines, about documentation that needed to be adjusted. Felicity responded with that efficient tone Marianne knew so well, but there was something more now, a complicity that went beyond the professional. Then Felicity said something that froze Marianne in place. She said Marianne was becoming more and more withdrawn, more and more dependent, that the plan was working. Exactly as predicted. Raphael laughed, a low, satisfied laugh, and replied that after the baby was born, it would be even easier. Marianne would have neither time nor energy to question anything. The company would be entirely theirs. Felicity added that Marianne had always been creative but never practical, that it was only a matter of time until she accepted that she had no place in management. Marianne recoiled, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred. She walked slowly to the bedroom and locked the door. She sat on the bed trying to process what she had just heard. It wasn't paranoia, it wasn't an overreaction, it wasn't pregnancy sensitivity. It was real. Raphael and Felicity were planning something against her. They were using her trust, her vulnerability, her pregnancy to push her away from everything she had built. And Felicity, her best friend, the one who had slept on her studio sofa during crises, the one with whom she had shared dreams and failures, was there, betraying her with frightening ease. The baby moved and Marianne instinctively placed her hand on her belly. She couldn't panic. She needed to think. She needed to understand exactly what was happening before acting. She remembered another time, years ago, another relationship that had begun with promises and ended with her having to rebuild her life from scratch. Back then, she had been paralyzed by fear, by the imposed silence, by the feeling that there was no way out. She had promised herself she would never again allow anyone to put her in that position. But now, it was happening again, differently, more sophisticated, more calculated, but happening nonetheless. When Raphael knocked on the door asking if everything was all right, Marianne quickly wiped away her tears and opened it. She said she was just tired, that she had walked too much. Raphael held her face in his hands and looked into her eyes with that expression she once thought was affectionate, but now saw as controlling. He said she needed to take better care of herself, that he was worried that she was too precious to take risks. Marianne forced a smile and nodded. But inside, something had changed. A small but intense flame began to burn. She would not be extinguished again, not this time. This time she would know exactly what to do. Marianne spent the night awake, but not in despair. It was a strategic vigil, where every thought was organized like pieces on a chessboard. She knew this Raphael better than he imagined. She knew his obsession with control, his need to document everything, his excessive confidence in his own security systems. He had built a technological prison around her, but prisons have keys, and those who understand the lock can find them. In the morning she behaved as always. She ate the breakfast Raphael prepared, wore one of the neutral outfits he approved of, smiled when he kissed her forehead before leaving. But when the elevator door closed, Marianne was already in motion. First her phone. Raphael had installed location and monitoring apps disguised as security. Marianne didn't uninstall them, it would be too obvious. Instead, she bought another phone at a discreet store in central London, paying in cash. It was a simple device, no social media, just for essential calls and messages. She hid it at the bottom of a drawer, among maternity clothes Raphael would never touch. Felicity appeared at noon, as had become customary. She greeted Marianne with that hug that now felt fake, asked about the baby with manufactured interest. Marianne responded with the same sweetness as always, offered tea, talked about trivialities. But while Felicity worked in the office with Raphael, Marianne took advantage of a moment when both were focused on a video conference to do something risky. She quietly entered the adjacent room where Raphael's personal servers were kept. He was paranoid about external security, but arrogant about internal security. He believed Marianne didn't understand technology, that she was just the creative, the artist. But Marianne had grown up with a programmer brother. She had learned the basics long before meeting Raphael. She connected a small pen drive to the secondary server, the one Raphael used for personal backups. She copied entire folders without even looking at the content, just selecting everything with a recent date. The process took 5 minutes that felt like hours. Her heart was beating so loudly she was sure they would hear it, but the video conference continued, Raphael and Felicity's voices echoing down the corridor. When the download finished, Marianne disconnected the pen drive, hid it in her maternity bra where no one would look, and returned to the bedroom as if she had never left. That night, while Raphael slept, Marianne locked herself in the bathroom and connected the pen drive to the old laptop she had brought from Notting Hill, the one Raphael thought she only used for recipes. What she found there left her breathless. There were documents with her forged name, bank transfers she had never authorized, contracts where her signature had been clearly tampered with. There were also emails between Raphael and Felicity, hundreds of them, where they meticulously planned how to remove Marianne from the company. One email in particular made her feel nauseous. Felicity wrote, laughing, at Marianne's naivety, saying she had always been easy to manipulate, that a little attention was all it took for her to hand everything over on a silver platter. Raphael responded by saying that after the baby was born, it would be simple to gain full custody. It would just be a matter of documenting that Marianne was emotionally unstable, incapable of properly caring for the child. Marianne closed the laptop and took a deep breath, fighting the urge to vomit. They didn't just want her company, they wanted her baby. They wanted to completely erase her from the very life she had built. The cruelty was not in physical violence, but in the cold planning, the calculated manipulation, the certainty that she wouldn't notice until it was too late. But she had already noticed, and now she had proof. The following days were worthy of an award-winning performance. Marianne became an even more docile version of herself. She accepted everything Raphael said, followed all of Felicity's suggestions, smiled when she should smile, agreed when she should agree. But behind this mask of submission, she was building something. Every night after Raphael fell asleep, she copied more files, recorded conversations. Using the hidden phone, photographed documents. She discovered that the attic's security system, the one Raphael was so proud of, had a flaw that only someone with administrative access would know. And Marianne had that access because Raphael had never bothered to completely remove it, thinking she wouldn't know what to do with it. She silently reprogrammed the system, causing all camera recordings to be saved not only on the local server, but also in a private cloud she created with an anonymous email. Every conversation between Raphael and Felicity, every moment they planned their next step, every gesture of growing intimacy between them, everything was being documented without their knowledge. The cage Raphael had built to imprison her was becoming the very witness to his cruelty. Julia called again, this time more alarmed. She said more people had been contacted, that the campaign to destroy Marianne's professional reputation was intensifying. Old clients received calls saying Marianne was going through serious problems, that she was not trustworthy, that it would be better to seek other suppliers. Marianne asked Julia to document everything, every name, every conversation, every attempt at sabotage. Julia asked if Marianne was all right, if she needed help. Marianne replied that she was better than everyone imagined, but that she needed Julia to trust her and wait. One afternoon, Raphael arrived with a folder of new documents. He said they were papers for the asset inventory, boring but necessary things that she needed to sign to ensure the baby's financial security. Marianne took the papers and, for the first time, read every line carefully. They were documents that transferred all assets in her name to a joint account controlled exclusively by Raphael. It was the final step. With that signature, she would be left with nothing. Raphael watched her with that encouraging smile, saying she didn't need to understand everything, that he had already reviewed it with 3 lawyers. Marianne returned the papers and said she preferred to read them calmly, that she had a headache. She saw irritation quickly pass through his eyes before the mask of understanding returned. He said it was no problem, that she had time, but that it would be good to resolve it soon. That night, Marianne couldn't sleep again. The baby moved restlessly, as if feeling the tension in her body. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered softly, promising that everything would be okay, that she would protect that small life growing inside her. She got up and went to the window. The city sparkled below, millions of lights representing millions of stories. How many other women were there, trapped in similar situations, silenced by shame or fear, believing there was no way out? Marianne felt a fierce determination take hold of her. She wouldn't do this just for herself. She would do it for all of them. She returned to her laptop and began to write, not a plea for help, but a plan. She organized all. The evidence she had, dated each document, transcribed each recorded conversation. She created a complete and detailed dossier, something no lawyer could ignore. She sent copies to 3 different emails, all anonymous, all with clear instructions on what to do if something happened to her. It was her life insurance. Raphael and Felicity didn't know it, but every move they made was being recorded, every cruel word archived, every plan exposed. The cage that was meant to destroy her was transforming into her most powerful weapon, and Marianne was just getting started. The sky over London was heavy that Friday. Afternoon dark, thick clouds threatening a typical November storm. Marianne felt something different in the air, an electricity that went beyond the weather. Raphael had left early, saying he had important meetings, but Felicity didn't appear as usual. The attic was too silent, and that silence carried a strange weight. Around 5 in the afternoon, Raphael called. His voice was serious, controlled. He said she needed to go to Cloud Secure's central office, that there were urgent papers to deal with, that a driver would pick her up in 20 minutes. Marianne felt the alarm sound inside her. They had never asked her to go to the office before. For months, Raphael had insisted she didn't need to worry about anything, that she should rest, and now suddenly it was urgent. She asked if it couldn't wait until Monday, and Raphael responded with a firmness that allowed no contestation. No, it had to be today, it had to be now. They were contractual matters that couldn't wait. Marianne agreed, but her heart pounded. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She dressed quickly, but before leaving she did something she had been mentally rehearsing for days. She took out the secret phone and sent a message to Julia with a code they had agreed upon. If Marianne didn't send another message in 2 hours, Julia should open the envelope she had left with her, with all instructions on what to do. It was her emergency plan, her last line of defense. She put the phone in her bag, along with a small recorder she had bought especially for this. She didn't know what she would find at the office, but she would be prepared. The driver was someone she had never seen before, a large, silent man who barely responded when she tried to make conversation. The journey was tense, with typical late afternoon heavy traffic and the storm beginning to unleash its fury over the city. Lightning cut across the dark sky, and the sound of rain hitting the car window was deafening. When they arrived at the Cloud Secure building, in an industrial area near the Thames Gateway, Marianne realized it wasn't the main office she knew. It was another building, older, looking like a converted warehouse or depot. Raphael waited at the entrance holding a large umbrella. He smiled when he saw her, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He said they had to move to that space temporarily for logistical reasons, that it was just to resolve some final details. He led her inside, and Marianne noticed the place was almost empty, just a few lights on, creating long shadows on the concrete walls. Felicity was there, leaning against a table, with an expression Marianne had never seen before. It wasn't the helpful friend. It was someone cold, calculating, almost triumphant. Raphael began to talk about the documents, about how this was the last step to finalize the company's restructuring. But as he spoke, Marianne realized there was something deeply wrong with the entire scenario. The doors locked automatically. She had heard the sound of the mechanism when they entered. The windows were high and sealed, and in the corner of the space there was a strange metal structure, like a large cage used for industrial testing. Marianne felt her blood run cold. Felicity approached, holding a clipboard with papers. Her voice was different, without the feigned sweetness from before. She said it was time for Marianne to stop stalling, that this would be her last chance to do things the easy way. The papers were clear: total transfer of company shares, renunciation of all corporate rights, shared custody with primary inclination towards Raphael. If she signed, she could leave and live a peaceful life with a generous pension. If she didn't sign, well, there were other ways to resolve the situation. Marianne looked at Raphael, searching for some trace of the man she thought she knew, but all she saw was a stranger, someone who had always been there, hidden behind the mask of care. She asked if he really thought she would sign that, if he really thought she would give up everything, including her child. Raphael sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. He said she didn't understand, that she had never understood. The company had always been his, the success had always been because of his connections and his work. She was just the creative facade, the pretty face to attract investors. And now, pregnant and emotionally unstable, it would be even easier to prove that she was not fit to manage anything. It was then that Felicity delivered the final blow. She took out her phone and showed Marianne a series of fake medical documents, forged psychiatric reports indicating she had been having episodes of instability, reports of erratic behavior, even manipulated photos that made her look drugged or intoxicated. Everything carefully constructed over the past few months. If Marianne didn't sign, these documents would be used to take custody of the baby as soon as it was born. She would be painted as an incapable, dangerous mother. And with the contacts Raphael had in the judiciary, it would be easy to make the narrative seem real. Marianne felt her legs weaken, but not from fear. It was pure rage, a fury so intense it almost made her forget where she was. But she remembered the baby, the plan, everything she had prepared. She couldn't lose control now. She said she needed a minute to think, that she was feeling dizzy. Raphael allowed it, magnanimous, indicating a chair. But instead of sitting, Marianne walked to the metal structure, trying to buy time, trying to understand how to get out of there. That's when the storm reached its peak. A huge lightning bolt lit up the sky, followed by thunder that made the entire building vibrate. And then the lights flickered and went out. The electrical system failed completely. Marianne heard Raphael curse, heard Felicity shout something about the generator. But what she realized was more serious. The power failure jammed the security mechanisms. The doors remained locked, but not in the way Raphael had planned. They were sealed, and the metal structure Marianne was near, used for pressure and resistance tests, also locked with her inside, the gate closing automatically as a safety measure. In almost complete darkness, illuminated only by occasional lightning flashes, Marianne realized she was trapped inside the metal cage. But instead of panicking, she felt a strange clarity. She was no longer unprotected. There were cameras there. Raphael had cameras. Everywhere. And that security system that had failed was certainly connected to the cloud backup she had configured. Everything that happened there would be recorded. She searched in the dark and found the small red light blinking in the corner of the ceiling. The camera was still working, powered by the emergency battery, and Marianne knew exactly what to do. She approached the cage bars, looked directly at the camera, and began to speak. She stated her full name, Marianne Saunders Smith, the date, the exact location. She said she was being held there against her will by Raphael, Augustus Miller, and Felicity Green. She described everything she had discovered in recent weeks, all the frauds, all the manipulations. And she asked, her voice firm even as she trembled inside, for them to protect her child, to ensure that child would not grow up under the control of people capable of doing what they were doing to her. Marianne finished her statement and leaned against the cold metal wall of the cage, listening to the chaos outside. Raphael shouted, trying to force the jammed mechanisms. Felicity desperately searched for some tool that could open the emergency locks. The storm continued to rage, and with each lightning flash Marianne saw their faces transformed by panic. They were no longer the self-assured manipulators. They were people who realized they had lost control of the situation. Inside the cage, Marianne felt the baby move intensely, as if sensing the danger too. She placed her hands on her belly and took a deep breath, trying to calm down. She needed to stay calm for the child. She couldn't let the stress harm her. She closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, counting each inhale, each exhale. She thought of everything she had prepared, all the evidence she had gathered. Julia should have already received the emergency signal. The envelope with instructions should already be in motion. And that camera continued to record every second of that horror. Hours passed that felt like days. Raphael finally managed to contact someone on his cell phone, shouting instructions on how to unlock the system. But the technicians were stuck in traffic, the entire city paralyzed by the storm. Water began to flood the building from under the doors, forming puddles that reflected the emergency lights. Felicity was hysterical, pacing back and forth, muttering that this shouldn't have happened, that it was supposed to be simple, quick, without complications. Raphael tried to maintain his composure, but Marianne saw the despair growing in his eyes. He realized that everything had spun completely out of control. It was Felicity who started talking too much. Nervous, she began to blame Raphael, saying he had promised no one would find out, that the plan was perfect. Raphael tried to silence her, but she was beyond being contained. She screamed that she was only there because he had guaranteed they would get everything, the company, the money, the baby. That he had promised they would live together, free from Marianne and her irritating naivety. Raphael finally lost his composure and shouted back, saying she had always been too greedy, too impatient, that she had ruined everything by insisting on rushing things. Marianne heard everything from inside the cage, and a part of her wanted to laugh at the irony. They were destroying each other, revealing every detail of the plan, every sordid motivation, all before the camera that continued to record relentlessly. She wouldn't need to do anything else. They themselves were building their own judgment. Sirens began to blare outside. Around 11 at night. Julia hadn't waited the full 2 hours. When Marianne hadn't responded after the first hour, she had already activated the emergency plan. She contacted a trusted lawyer Marianne had indicated, and together they went directly to the police station with some of the evidence. The police took the accusations seriously, especially when they saw the forged documents and recordings of compromising conversations. They sent 2 patrol cars to the attic address, and when they didn't find Marianne there, they began a search using the tracking of her official phone, the one Raphael monitored, thinking he had total control. When the police finally managed to enter the industrial building, they found a scene that shocked even the most experienced. Raphael and Felicity were exhausted, drenched by the water that had flooded the premises, surrounded by wet papers and damaged equipment. And Marianne inside the metal cage with protective hands over her belly, her eyes open and alert, red marks on her wrists where she had tried to force the bars, but with a fierce dignity that no metal could imprison. The first police officer to approach was a woman in her 40s, Sergeant Andrea Stone, who looked at Marianne and immediately understood. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't ask for explanations. She simply quickly coordinated the technical team to release the cage, called an ambulance, and ensured Marianne was treated with care and respect. Meanwhile, other police officers were already collecting evidence, photographing everything, confiscating Raphael and Felicity's electronic equipment. Raphael tried to explain, using that controlled voice that had always worked before. He said it was a misunderstanding, that Marianne was confused, that the pregnancy had left her emotionally unstable, but Sergeant Andrea was not interested in listening. She showed the documents Julia had brought, the fraudulent transfers, the conversations planning everything, and then she played her final card. The building's own surveillance system had captured everything, including the moment they locked Marianne inside. There was even audio, thanks to the sophisticated system Raphael was so proud of having installed. Every word spoken in that warehouse was recorded, every confession extracted by desperation, every truth revealed by panic. Marianne was taken to the hospital accompanied by Julia, who held her hand throughout the journey. In the emergency room, doctors performed all necessary examinations. The baby was fine, its heart beating strong and regular, despite the extreme stress Marianne had endured. She was a little dehydrated, had minor abrasions on her wrists, was in emotional shock, but she had survived. Mother and daughter had survived. As she lay on the hospital gurney, receiving saline and being monitored, Marianne finally allowed the tears to fall. They were not tears of defeat, but of liberation. Everything she had held back for months, all the fear, all the anger, all the pain of betrayal, could finally be felt. Julia stayed by her side, repeating that everything was okay now, that she was safe, that she would never have to return to that attic, to that life that wasn't hers. The police station worked throughout the night. The evidence was so abundant that the case was deemed a priority. The prosecutors who took over clearly saw that it was not just a marital dispute, but an elaborate scheme of fraud, coercion, and psychological abuse. Raphael and Felicity were formally detained, their phones and computers seized for forensic analysis. Every email, every message, every document would be scrutinized. And the security camera recordings, both from the warehouse and from the attic that Marianne had reprogrammed, would be the most eloquent witnesses of all. When dawn broke, Marianne was settled in a safe house, a discreet place in West London, coordinated by an organization specializing in supporting victims of domestic and psychological violence. It was a simple but welcoming house, with a garden and natural light, so different from the glass and marble attic. There she would have psychological counseling, legal assistance, and most importantly, peace. No one would control her steps. No one would decide what she should wear or eat or think. She was free. The cage had finally opened, not because someone had freed her, but because she herself had found the key, using her intelligence, courage, and refusal to be silenced again. The first few days in the safe house were filled with internal silence. Marianne woke up startled during the night, checking the doors, checking the windows, needing to convince herself that she was truly safe. The psychologist who attended her, Dr. Beatrice Campbell, explained that this was normal, that the body held on to trauma even when the mind already understood that the danger had passed. Gradually, through careful conversations and breathing exercises, Marianne began to process everything she had experienced. It wasn't easy to admit that she had been manipulated, that she had trusted people who planned to destroy her. But Dr. Beatrice always reinforced that it wasn't her fault, that professional manipulators know exactly how to deceive their victims, and that recognizing this was the first step to healing. Julia visited almost every day, bringing news from the outside world. The story had leaked to the press, but in a controlled way, through the lawyer handling Marianne's case. The narrative was not sensationalist. It focused on the facts, on the systematization of psychological abuse, on the courage of a woman who gathered evidence against her own oppressors. The repercussion was enormous. Women from all over the country began to share their own stories of controlling relationships, of silent manipulation, of violence that left no physical marks but destroyed from within. Marianne's case became a symbol of something larger, a national conversation about forms of abuse that often went unnoticed. Meanwhile, Marianne returned to doing what had always saved her: creating. In the small improvised studio in the safe house, she began to draw again. Her hands, which had been still for months, began to move across the paper with creative urgency. The designs she created were different from anything she had done before. They were pieces that spoke of imprisonment and freedom, of control and autonomy, of breaking and rebuilding. She used stylized bars, fabrics that looked metallic but were soft, colors that transitioned between oppressive gray and hopeful gold. It was fashion as a manifesto, as therapy, as resistance. She named the collection The Cage, embracing the symbol of her pain to transform it into something powerful. Each piece had a name that told part of her story. Locked in, watched, silenced, but also awakened, reactive, free. When she showed the first sketches to Julia, her friend was silent for long seconds, then hugged Marianne tightly and said it was revolutionary, that it was necessary, that the world needed to see it. It was Julia who, without Marianne's knowledge, discreetly photographed one of the sketches and posted it on a social media account dedicated to independent designers. The image went viral within hours. Women reposted, commented, asked where they could buy those pieces. Digital influencers began to talk about the story behind the collection, about Marianne and her struggle. In a few days, The Cage ceased to be just a personal project and became a movement. Marianne received messages from hundreds of women saying they identified, that they too had gone through similar situations, that they wanted to wear those clothes as a way to tell the world they survived. The trial was scheduled for 3 months later, enough time for all evidence to be analyzed and catalogued. The prosecution built a solid case, using not only the recordings and documents Marianne had gathered, but also testimonies from cloud-secure employees who had witnessed strange behavior from Raphael, and from clients who were contacted with lies about Marianne. The most impactful, however, was the forensic analysis of the seized computers and phones. Technicians found everything: The emails planning each stage of the manipulation, the fraudulent bank transfers, the falsified medical documents, even conversations where Raphael and Felicity discussed how to gain exclusive custody of the baby as soon as it was born. Raphael's defense tried to argue that everything was a misunderstanding, that they were just business discussions being misinterpreted. But the strategy collapsed when the prosecution presented a specific recording, captured by the attic's own cameras that Marianne had reprogrammed. In the recording, Raphael and Felicity were alone, talking with an intimacy that made the nature of their relationship clear. Felicity laughed and said that soon they could even remove Marianne's name from everything, that she would be completely erased. Raphael replied that after the baby was born, it would be even easier, that they would document every supposed mistake Marianne made as a mother until they had enough ammunition to completely remove her. When the recording was played in court, the silence was absolute. Marianne, sitting in the victim's bench with her belly now in its 8th month, felt the baby kick hard, as if also reacting to that exposed cruelty. She looked at Raphael, searching for some sign of remorse, but all she saw was a man whose face had collapsed, all arrogance and control evaporated. Felicity beside him was pale, trembling, finally comprehending the magnitude of what they had done and the consequences they would face. The most powerful moment of the trial was when Marianne testified. With a firm voice, without crying, she explained to the court that control doesn't always shout, doesn't always raise a hand, doesn't always leave visible marks. Sometimes it says, "I'll protect you." Sometimes it says, "I know what's best for you." Sometimes it says, "You're overreacting, being too sensitive, misunderstanding." She explained how psychological violence slowly corrodes, how it makes the victim doubt their own perception, how it isolates and silences. She recounted that it wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this, that years ago she had survived another abusive relationship and had promised herself she would never be silenced again. But that Raphael's manipulation was sophisticated, disguised as love and care, and that it had almost managed to destroy her. The judge, Judge Helen Foster, a 60-year-old woman with decades of experience, listened to everything with deep attention. At the end of the testimony, she did something unusual. She revealed that she herself many years ago had gone through a similar situation, and that she perfectly understood every word Marianne had said. She stated that cases like that were more common than society would like to admit, and that it was time to clearly name what had happened: systematic abuse, coercion, fraud, and an attempt to completely destroy a person. The entire room fell into respectful silence, and Marianne finally allowed some tears to fall, not of sadness but of validation. Someone understood, someone believed, someone recognized that her pain was real and that her struggle was legitimate. The sentence was handed down a week after the trial. Judge Helen Foster was clear and forceful. Raphael Augustus Miller was found guilty of coercion, corporate fraud, document forgery, false imprisonment, and aggravated psychological violence. The sentence was set at 8 years of imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for the first 3 years. Furthermore, he lost all rights to CloudSecure, which fully returned to the control of Marianne, its legitimate co-founder. All fraudulent transfers were reversed, all falsified documents annulled. Felicity Green, as an active accomplice in all stages of the scheme, received 5 years of imprisonment and was prohibited from performing any business consulting function for the next 10 years. When she tried to flee the country using false documents 2 weeks before the sentencing, she was intercepted at Heathrow Airport, which only aggravated her situation. Marianne was in the safe house when she received the news. Julia called, shouting with joy, reading every part of the sentence over the phone. Justice had been served. Not in the spectacular way movies show, but in the real procedural, documented way. Every piece of evidence Marianne had gathered, every recording she had made, every document she had copied, everything contributed to building an undeniable case. She had fought intelligently, strategically, courageously, and she had won. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Marianne went into labor. It was a calm birth, assisted by an attentive medical team and by Julia. who held her hand during each contraction. When the little girl was finally born, with that strong and healthy cry, Marianne held her in her arms and cried all the tears she had held back. They were not tears of pain, but of deep relief, of overwhelming love, of gratitude for having survived together. She named her daughter Olivia, which means envious or pale, but for Marianne it simply meant life. That child was living proof that not all control can destroy, that not all cages can imprison what is essentially free. The safe house was temporary. 3 months after Olivia's birth, Marianne found a small house in Islington, a quiet, leafy neighborhood, away from the frantic center but still connected to the city. The house had a garden, large windows that let the sun in, and a studio on the second floor perfect for her work. It was simple compared to the luxurious attic, but it was genuinely hers, chosen by her, with no one deciding every detail of her life. The Cage collection was officially launched 6 months later. Marianne renamed the project Cage and Light, symbolizing not only the imprisonment she had lived, but also the rebirth she had achieved. The launch was at a gallery in Notting Hill, the neighborhood where everything had begun for her. It was an intimate but powerful event, with only 50 guests, all women who in some way connected with the story. There were survivors of abusive relationships, lawyers specializing in domestic violence, mental health professionals, journalists who covered the case with respect and sensitivity. The pieces were displayed not on traditional mannequins, but on structures that resembled open cages, as if each outfit was freeing itself. The fabrics combined strength and delicacy, metallic with silk, synthetic leather with light linen. Each piece told a story of transformation. The response was overwhelming. All pieces were sold in the first hour, and orders began to arrive from all over the UK. International fashion magazines requested interviews. Marianne was invited to speak at universities, to panels on female entrepreneurship, to conversations about psychological violence and recovery. Cloud Secure was completely restructured. Marianne brought in new partners, people who shared her values of transparency and ethics. The company changed its focus, specializing in security systems not for control, but for genuine protection, working especially with organizations that support victims of violence. It was a way to transform something that had been used against her into a tool of protection for other women. The company prospered under the new management, tripling in value in 2 years. Marianne also created a specific fund, using part of the profits from Cage and Light to financially support women who needed to escape abusive situations but lacked resources. The fund covered costs for lawyers, temporary housing, psychological treatment, and even initial investment so that these women could restart professionally. It was her way of transforming pain into purpose, of ensuring that her experience served to ease the path of others. A year and a half after everything, Marianne was invited to give a lecture at an international women's rights event in Edinburgh. It was her first international trip since everything had happened, and she took Olivia, who was a year and a half old and starting to speak her first words. In the lecture, she told her story in a raw but hopeful way, explaining how she had survived psychological control, how she had gathered evidence, how she had used the very surveillance structure against those who had created it. But more importantly, she spoke about reconstruction, about how it is possible to be reborn after being systematically destroyed, about how strength is not in never falling, but in getting up as many times as necessary. At the end of the lecture, a young woman approached with tears in her eyes. She said she was living a similar situation, that her boyfriend controlled every aspect of her life, but she was afraid to leave because she thought she wouldn't be able to survive alone. Marianne held her hands and said something she had learned painfully. The feeling that we couldn't survive alone is exactly what our oppressors want us to feel, but it's a lie. We are stronger than they want us to believe, and we are never truly alone. There are always people willing to help, you just need the courage to ask. The young woman hugged Marianne and thanked her, saying that conversation had changed everything for her. Back in the UK, Marianne received an unexpected invitation. A major television network wanted to make a documentary series about her story, not in a sensationalist way, but educational, showing the signs of abusive relationships that often go unnoticed. Marianne accepted on the condition that part of the budget be allocated to the Victim Support Fund. The series aired 6 months later and had an immense impact. Helplines for women in situations of violence reported a 300% increase in calls. Many women finally found the courage to name what they were experiencing and seek help. 2 years after everything, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Marianne was in her garden watching Olivia play. The girl ran among the flowers, laughed loudly, talked non-stop. She was a free, safe, loved child. Marianne thought about how everything could have been different, how she almost lost everything, how the cage almost destroyed her. But she also thought about how every difficulty had strengthened her, how every pain had transformed into purpose, how what was meant to destroy her became the very source of her rebirth. A journalist from an international magazine called to ask the last question of an interview: if Marianne still thought about Raphael. Marianne smiled, watching Olivia chase a butterfly. She answered with quiet honesty that yes, sometimes she did, but without burden, without consuming anger, without fear. He had become too small in her memory to occupy any significant space in who she was now. She added that Olivia would never learn fear as a language, that she would grow up knowing her voice matters, that her boundaries must be respected, that no form of true love includes control. She hung up the phone and turned her attention back to her daughter. Olivia brought a yellow flower and handed it to her mother with that smile that lit up everything. Marianne held the flower and hugged the girl, feeling the warm sun on her face, the gentle wind in her hair, the real and hard-won freedom encompassing both of them. The woman who had once been systematically erased had been reborn stronger, more aware, more whole. The cage that was meant to destroy her had transformed into the symbol of her ascent, and her voice, once stifled, now echoed throughout the world as living proof that no chain, physical or emotional, can permanently contain someone who decides to be free. Dear listeners, we hope that Marianne's story and her journey of rebirth have deeply touched your hearts. If this narrative has awakened any emotion, reflection, or identification, know that you are not alone. To continue experiencing stories that explore the strength of the human spirit, the complexity of relationships, and the courage needed to rebuild our lives, we have a special playlist waiting for you. Find it by clicking here on the side. Every story we share carries a message of hope, resilience, and transformation. If Marianne's story resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next narratives we bring daily. And in the comments, share your reflections, your own stories of overcoming, or simply say what you felt. This is a community of voices that deserve to be heard. We await you in the comments, and always remember, no cage is strong enough to imprison someone who decides to be free.